Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Vagabon called Infinite Worlds. Okay, so a couple months back there was a think piece published, I think on Fusion, that tried to equate alternative genres in music with the alt-right in American politics. And it was stupid. Amazingly so. There was a very good reason why Anthony Fantano of The Needle Drop did a stink piece episode on it. Really a terrible piece of writing. Now, I already ranted about this somewhat on Twitter, but for speculation's sake, let's try to get to a point that the author completely missed but might have been targeting. Let's put aside how much it completely ignored the much more diverse scene that is punk, or how it seemed completely ignorant of the strident political leanings that ran through alternative rock and alternative country, and not just in the 90s, but now as well, or how the piece seemed distinctly out of its own depth and uncomfortable even broaching the idea of alternative or conscious hip-hop or backpacker rap. No. Let's talk about indie rock specifically and raise this question. Is this genre and the market that it primarily targets predominantly white? Well, given that we all live in the internet age and we all listen to everything, and it's far from the only genre where you could ask that question, particularly in the United States, you might have a shot of maybe making that argument, presuming of course you ignore Block Party, TV on the radio, and a host of smaller acts with black members that have existed over the past 35 years of indie rock and maybe never really got the attention of critics or the mainstream public. Just because they didn't get a lot of attention didn't mean they didn't exist. Hell, there might be an uncomfortable truth there, that the majority of rock critics, who on aggregate were middle-class white guys, they tended to favor and promote music that spoke to their worldview, particularly in the early genesis of the genre. Hell, as much as I might like these bands, I'm not exactly ignorant to why the war on drugs, the national, and real estate are popular in indie rock. They cater to a very specific sound and very specific demographic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it seems like slowly, often agonizingly so, that both the population of critics and preferred taste are starting to diversify, and we're seeing more acts in the indie rock outside of the typical hipster type get critical appraisal. Guess what? We can all be insufferable hipsters now. Well, hell, it's almost to the point where it can ring as a little bit patronizing and tokenizing to even bring it up. So even despite this intro, I'm going to try to avoid that additional part of the conversation, stick to the music, and into the scene comes Vagabon, who has attracted a lot of attention for its frontwoman, multi-instrumentalist and producer Letita Tanco. Growing up in Cameroon before moving to New York, she found a scene that cultivated her eclectic style and gave her a platform for more thought-provoking lyrics that certainly attracted a lot of my interest. Hell, given how stale and retro-leaning that so much indie rock can feel over the past couple of years, I definitely appreciate a fresh, new perspective. So, what did we get with the debut Infinite Worlds? Well, it's pretty good for what it is, and pretty good for an indie rock debut. I won't say it's reinventing the wheel when it comes to sound or grooves or hooks, which for some people expecting something brand new, that'll be enough to throw it aside, but I do think there are some seeds of quality here, albeit not quite as pronounced as I would typically prefer and I was hoping. I'd argue the biggest strength of this album comes in the writing, which means I'm inclined to be a lot more favorable to it, but I'm also not going to say that it blew me out of the water or is without issues either. I totally get why it's getting a lot of critical acclaim, but I'm not quite on board in the same way. And let's start with my biggest problem with this release. I'm not exactly wowed by Letita Tanco as a frontwoman and singer. She's not a bad vocalist in a husky, kind of drippy, very mid-90s indie alternative style with hints of more strident and higher multi-tracking, but if you're familiar with this type of singing and presentation, you're not really going to be wowed by this. You will have heard it before. I think a considerable part of this is that placing her against this type of instrumentation and production. Guitars that can occasionally pick up some seething edge when they aren't graceful and liquid, punchy bass melodies, and drums that actually have a surprising amount of texture and grit to augment their grooves on tracks like Fear and Force, or Minneapolis, or Cleaning House, or especially Cold Apartment, probably my favorite song here. Again, these tracks don't exactly have a lot of structure to them beyond some decent crescendos, but there is some intensity that comes with the fizzy percussion breaking into a heavier pickup on Fear and Force, or how the back half of Cleaning House seethes against the acoustic melody, or how the heavy groove of Cold Apartment really kicks in. And I just wish that Tamco could match the instrumentation's intensity beyond her throaty, willowy vocals that can feel a shade too reserved. I get the 90s style that she's calling back to, but I've never really been wild about that style. Of course, it's also ignoring the centerpiece of this album, which is a gauzy electronic piece with overlapping hazy vocals against a sparse pop and skitter of beat that goes on for 5 minutes and doesn't remotely fit with the rest of the instrumentation here, which doesn't even touch on how the last notes of that repeated melodic phrase in that song end kind of weirdly. It's really just an odd piece for this album. And yeah, that sort of slightly askew melodic progression is common across the this album, especially when it syncopates with some of the more off-kilter grooves, but it's a lot easier to integrate into rougher punk tunes in this sort of spacey piece. And overall, I'm okay with it. It just didn't work there, but more because that song doesn't work for the album. But what I want to get into more here is the writing. And in part, it's a big reason why I brought up the whole piece about the lack of diversity in certain brands of indie rock right now. Mostly because it's a common theme that runs through a lot of this album. Right from the embers, that Latita Tamko, she establishes that she's the outsider, the small fish in a big pond with the sharks, be they critics, unfamiliar audiences, or fellow musicians and producers. But what's telling in the next few songs is that she really isn't all that different in terms of themes and execution than many of her sensitive contemporaries. Lingering in misbegotten love, miscommunication, and heartbreak while encountering an old friend on the road and not really being able to reconcile. If anything, one of the strongest thematic undercurrents is a lack of concrete space and home that she can call her own. An insecurity that contributes to some of the more melancholic tones that, yeah, work pretty well here. But if I'm being honest, what I find a lot more compelling is when it seems like Tamko is speaking more about her space in the genre, which is why Cleaning House is such a standout of a track. Not just in defining her place, but highlighting the underlying insecurity that comes with certain sensitive indie types seeing their space popularized and occupied by people who are not just like them. And then on the closer, Alive and a Well, she goes even further and speaks to how the audience treats such acts. Disposable. For moments of cathartic response, leaving them in spaces of discomfort even as she tries to unpack where she eventually wants to land up. It speaks to the same underlying instability that runs through this entire project and gives it a lot of its tension. And while she doesn't shy away from the lines that so many defensive genre defenders will have likely thrown in her direction now stepping into indie rock, she also understands that the roots of that emotion, because on some level, she shares some of that same insecurity. She's not exactly going to excuse their blame there, but she at least understands where it's coming from. And yeah, it lends to a sense of populism that makes this project work for what it is. Again, it's a little short for this sort of debut, and it's not really reinventing the wheel sonically, but there are tones and progressions I like amidst the ones that I don't think work all that well. And that's enough for me to give it a nice 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. I'm not about to give it the same overwhelming praise that so many other outlets have already, but yeah, it's solid. If you're curious and you like this brand of 90s indie rock, check it out. You won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know a little late with this review, and actually the next review I'm going to be dropping after this, I'm going to be much later on, but whatever. Hope you guys liked it. I got the link in the description if you want to buy the record, and I got the poll up there if you guys want to tell me how you felt. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my Patreon scheduling process, the link is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, or perhaps more, and once a week the higher Patreon contributors get to add records to my schedule. More details right there. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.